Welcome, everybody. I am super excited to be here today with the one and only Michael Battista. He's famous in his home country, Canada, because he is a legend in the asylum community. We are going to be discussing the difference between USA asylum law and Canadian asylum law. I know a lot about USA asylum law. I have done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of asylum cases in my career, but I know next to nothing about Canadian asylum law. And that's why we have today Michael Battista.
Thank you, Brad. Wow, what an introduction. I certainly hope I don't disappoint after that. But yes, as you mentioned, I've been practicing immigration and refugee law here in Canada for 31 years now. Time flies, and I never tire of it. We have a high volume of refugee cases as well as other files in different areas, family class and economic class, but we're here to talk about Canadian asylum law.
Generally, how do you get asylum? I can tell you, here in the United States, you have to show a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership to a particular social group. However, what do you do in Canada to qualify for asylum?
Well, what you just described is the convention refugee definition. It comes from international law. We have that definition here in Canada. But in addition, we have another risk category called a person in need of protection. And it's not restricted to those five grounds that you mentioned. So this category actually looks at whether somebody's at risk of torture, cruel and unusual treatment or punishment in their country, or if they have a risk to their life based on their country's inability to provide medical care. So there's the convention refugee definition that you described, and this person in need of protection definition that's really quite separate.
And so do you find that more people qualify for that second definition of clients that walk into your door, or how do you do the analysis?
It really depends. Like as you described, there's five grounds to, or five bases on which you can base your fear in the convention refugee definition. If for whatever reason you can't tie your fear to one of those grounds, let's say you're coming from a civil war situation and there's nothing particular about you that puts you at risk, you can rely on that protected person definition. Or if you're at risk of torture, because somebody has selected you based on, I don't know, your level of wealth or their suspicions of your activities, you can rely on that ground. I would say most people are successful on the convention refugee ground, but there is this backup in case people don't qualify.
Yeah, so that's really interesting because here in Michigan and in the United States, immigration law is federal law, so it's the same for all 50 states. And here in the United States, especially here in Michigan, it's really difficult to win these claims from, for example, Mexico or Central America, where people are fleeing cartel violence, gang violence, extortion, or gang recruitment. Most, if not almost all of them, are denied on a regular basis. Would these types of claims potentially be successful then in Canada? Like if someone, for example, fits in that type of category, would they be possibly more likely to win in Canada?
Absolutely. We see a very high volume of cases, particularly from Mexico and other Central American, South American countries that are based on fears from cartels. And yes, you can successfully. We have had recently a few cases that have been successful on those grounds. The acceptance rate generally in Canada, I think, is much higher than it is in the United States. For example, most recently, the statistics are that 53% of cases from Mexico are successful. When you look at other countries, Honduras, 80% of cases are successful, 82% from El Salvador. You know, a lot of these cases are not based on the formal refugee definition. They're more complicated. They're fears of criminals, they're fears of people involved in cartels. And they do meet with success in Canada. And I think a lot of it is because they're not attached to that five ground refugee definition, that they have the alternative person in need of protection definition.
Yeah, and I want to take a moment and honestly say thank you because you literally are a lifesaver for many clients that walk into my door where my heart goes out to them. I want to help them. I want to help save their life. But literally, the asylum law here in the United States does not provide that protection. So I have this new resource now, my Canadian immigration attorney, Michael Battista, where I can send to for get a diagnostic. And oftentimes they're in a much better situation to apply for asylum in Canada. And it's really cool to have this resource available. And I'd really encourage my colleagues who are U.S. immigration lawyers, make that connection either with Attorney Battista or other competent attorneys in Canada so that we can provide a safe location for people who are literally fleeing for their lives. Now, here in the United States, we have this 1-year deadline. And what I mean by that is if you want to apply for asylum here in the United States, you have to file the application form I-589, application for asylum or withholding of removal, within 1 year of entering the United States. Is there any type of requirement like that in Canada?
There isn't any type of requirement. There's no 1 year deadline here. If you're physically present in Canada, we've had, for example, students who have been studying for a year, 2 years, and they just realize that they're entitled to make a claim, or circumstances arise where they believe themselves to be at risk, and they make a claim. So we don't have any deadline by which you have to make your claim in Canada.
Nice, nice. Now, also here in the United States, there's 2 ways to apply for asylum. You can apply what's called affirmatively, meaning you come into the country and within 1 year, you apply to the asylum office. Or if you're caught by immigration and you're without legal status and you get put into immigration court, you can apply defensively. Is there any type such as a difference in Canada?
No, there's no difference. If you're eligible to make a refugee claim, you are treated just like everybody else who's eligible to make a refugee claim. The closest analogy I would say is that we have at the back end this type of application that can be made called a pre-removal risk assessment. And this pre-removal risk assessment is done for people whose claims for protection have been refused, their appeals have been refused, and it happens just before they're about to be removed. And this pre-removal risk assessment looks at whether some new risk or new evidence has arisen since the time of their rejection that would put them at risk prior to the removal. But we don't have anything like you have down there in terms of affirmative or defensive applications.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is the majority of claims here in the United States, especially from Mexico and Central America, are actually defensive. For example, if you go to the border and you're allowed into the United, paroled in, you're automatically put into immigration court removal proceedings. So you have to apply defensively. And there's a huge contrast between approval rate and immigration judges all across the country. For example, cities like San Francisco and New York, some judges have an approval rate almost 90%, whereas other parts of the country, some immigration judges have an asylum approval rate of less than 10%, some less than 5%. Here in Michigan, the judges are about 1 in 3, around 33% on average for the immigration judges here in Michigan. So it really varies. And one case that might lose in Michigan could win for that exact same case in San Francisco. Do you know if Canada has these type of issues in terms of variances? Is anyone even keeping track of approval rate in different locations? Is there any information on that?
Yeah, I would say that, there are slight variations in regions. So the regions that we have in Canada are the Western region, which includes British Columbia and the Prairie provinces, the Central region, which is predominantly Ontario, and Quebec, and then the Eastern region. And I would say there are slight variations between acceptance rates, but there's nothing that would incentivize somebody from moving their claim to one part of the country or another.
Sure. And another issue here in the United States is the amount of time that it takes to complete. The government is constantly trying to do things because traditionally it's taken years and years. And for many cases, even now, it still takes years and years. I mean, I've had a case just a little bit ago that was, I ended up getting the case dismissed and had been pending over 10 years in the immigration court. Is there an immigration deportation court system in Canada, or can you talk briefly a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, I mean, our processing times have fluctuated over the years, but I think the government has allocated enough resources recently to make sure that there's efficient processing. Look, you're still waiting probably about a year from the time of making a claim to actually having your hearing into your claim. And removal processes can take long as well. But we don't have anything. It certainly would be exceptional for anything to go over a few years in terms of processing.
Sure. And are immigrants authorized to work while they're waiting for a claim? So if it's going to take more than a year or up to a year or even a little bit longer in Canada, are they eligible to work, or are they penalized if they're working without authorization?
No, they are authorized to work. So filing a refugee claim entitles one to file an application for a work permit, and that's an open work permit that allows them to work wherever they want, anywhere in the country. It also entitles them to healthcare. So the federal government provides healthcare to refugees throughout their process, right until the time of removal.
And approximately how long does it take to get a work permit after you file for like a refugee claim? Or
We're seeing it happen in a matter of weeks. There are processing times, but I would say probably you're looking at about 6 weeks after making the claim, 6 to 8 weeks.
okay. And what about if you end up working prior to receiving your authorization to work? Is there a penalty towards your asylum case or your refugee case?
I mean, technically, you're not complying with our immigration legislation, but it's not like that will result in the denial of your work permit afterwards.
Yeah. So interesting, in the United States, if you file for asylum, you actually have to wait 150 days before you can even apply for a work permit. And the work permit usually takes months, sometimes can take up to a year to arrive. So there's a big problem here in the United States where people are here and they're technically not eligible to work. Although there doesn't seem to be any, I haven't lost any asylum claims because most of my clients have to survive. So they're working without a work permit if they're honest on their applications. But it makes it really difficult because, for example, they don't have access to a social security card or a driver's license until they have their work permit. So that's an interesting difference between the United States and Canada. Is asylum, now, is there a difference here in the United States? A refugee, you actually have to apply from overseas. So if you're here physically present in the United States, you're actually applying for asylum. In Canada, is there a difference between an asylum and a refugee, or is it one and the same? Can you briefly talk about that?
It's one and the same. So we process people who are in need of protection based on whether they meet the convention refugee definition or whether there are these additional grounds of fearing torture, cruel, unusual treatment or punishment, or risk to their life based on inadequate medical care in their country. But they're all kind of called refugees. There's no distinction between, we don't commonly use the phrase asylum. And certainly we do have people who apply from overseas for refugee sponsorship to Canada, but we classify them all as refugees.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I never knew that. This is fun talking with you. Now, the other thing too, when it comes to refugees, it seems here in the United States a very politically heated and opinionated issue. It drives, it's one of the main talking points, whether pro or against. In Canada, do you see that type of, in terms of refugees being used as a political tool in elections?
Not so much, to be honest. Like, I think that when public opinion tends to turn against refugees, it tends to be when inadequate resources are allocated to the process. And we're seeing cases take years and years to process in Canada. That kind of gets the public riled up because they just feel like the system's not working. But I'm proud to say that I can't really remember a time in recent history when the mood has turned against refugees. Canada's always been a very welcoming country to refugees and immigrants. Statistics have been published that show that we're really in need of newcomers in this country. And so generally the public grasps that and understands the need for us to bump up our population and also to provide a safe place for refugees. Canada, as you might recall, was part of the Underground Railroad, and we pride ourselves on that. I founded an organization called Rainbow Railroad based on that Underground Railroad model, and that's really part of our national identity.
Yeah. And one of the most beautiful aspects of asylum law here in the United States is it is actually a very realistic way to win asylum for my clients based on protection for LGBT claims, because as we know, many places in the world are not very LGBT friendly. Do you see that a lot of people from across the world are moving to Canada for LGBT protection?
It's definitely been part of Canada's brand to be open and welcoming to the LGBTQ community. And we're one of the first countries, for example, that recognized equal marriage in the world. And that kind of branded us as being a safe, open place. And we are an attractive spot for the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, I have always loved Canada. If I didn't grow up here in Michigan and just love the United States so much, I mean, I really love the values of Canada. I mean, from a little kid, we used to do exchange programs with Canada, and I really value the values of Canada. And it's beautiful to have you as a neighbor. We share the Great Lakes, which I'm totally in love with. And so thank you for being such a beautiful neighbor. We really appreciate.
Oh no, like it's our pleasure. Canada is far from being perfect, but it has a lot of values, and I think it has a national character and a reputation that I'm proud of.
Absolutely. Now, it seems like Canada's definitely an easier place to win refugee status. What is the process like? Let's say someone's from Mexico, someone comes up and basically is about to kill them because they're not paying extortion fees. They've been advised that this is going to be a hard case to win asylum in the United States. Would they literally just have to make it to the border of Canada to apply for asylum, or how does that work?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the beauty, one of the things I'm proud of the Canadian refugee system is that if you are eligible to make a refugee claim, you get face to face in front of a decision maker and you get to explain your story in the context of what we call an oral hearing. So if there's any questions or doubts about your case, you get the ability to defend yourself, to basically explain yourself. And in most provinces, you get the right to government paid counsel, legal aid counsel, to represent you at these hearings. So I'm very proud of that for sure. But we don't let everybody get to that hearing. We have an initial stage where we screen people for what's called eligibility. Eligibility means, are you eligible to actually have your claim referred to an oral hearing? And there are certain grounds of eligibility that screen people out. Yes, we screen out the serious criminals, the security threats, but probably the biggest screening out of people are people who are subject to what we call the Safe Third Country Agreement. People who travel through the United States and come to Canada are presumptively ineligible to make their claims here. There are big exceptions to the Safe Third Country Agreement. I mean, people shouldn't think that they're out of commission in terms of traveling through the United States. For example, if people have relatives, close relatives in Canada, they are not subject to the Safe Third Country Agreement. If people manage somehow to cross the land border and stay here 14 days without being detected, they are not subject to the Safe Third Country Agreement. So while the Safe Third Country Agreement catches a lot of people who travel through the United States to Canada, it's not, there are exceptions to the agreement.
So are there boats of people then that literally go from Mexico, taking what we call here in the United States undocumented immigrants and taking them directly to Canada for processing for their claims, like human smugglers, or coyotes is what they're often called here in the United States?
I mean, they exist, as you know, they exist in getting people to the United States. And in any refugee receiving country, there's an issue of smugglers being brought to the country in various means. And certainly the agreements like the Safe Third Country Agreement just encourage smugglers to do exactly that, to get people around the agreements. So most definitely that does happen.
Okay. And for the exceptions to filing for refugee status in Canada with regard to the safe country, does that literally mean that if an immigrant walks from Mexico, goes through the United States, spends only 1 week in the United States, meets with me, and I tell him, like, look, realistically, I don't think you're going to win your asylum claim. If they then go to the Ambassador Bridge to cross from Detroit into Windsor, Canada, they would likely be denied their refugee claim because of the Safe Third Country Agreement, correct?
That's right. Unless they have close relatives in Canada, they would be told that they don't qualify to make a refugee claim. So it's not that their refugee claim would be denied, it's that they wouldn't even be given the right to proceed with a refugee claim.
However, if they subsequently snuck into Canada, waited 2 weeks, and then applied, then they would be eligible.
That's right.
Fascinating. This is amazing.
It is fascinating. Or if they marry a Canadian citizen and have a Canadian spouse, they can get around the Safe Third Country Agreement.
Oh, that's a really good idea, actually, in terms of, I mean, I use it all the time in my artillery for immigration law. It's like, oh, you're married to a US citizen. Even if you entered without a visa, there may be a way that I can fix your status to become a permanent resident. Very, very interesting talking with you today.
Yeah.
Now, on the final topic, and when you're actually preparing clients, what ideal preparation do you do? Like, what is your ideal client come to you, and how do you want them to respond in terms of preparation for these types of cases?
Yeah, it's a good question. So obviously the ideal client is a well-prepared client who's come with as much documentation about their identity, but also about their personal experiences to Canada. But typically, the process that we follow in our office is that we have an introductory meeting with the client to just explain what the process looks like, what the expectations of them are, and what their expectations of us should be. And after that introductory meeting, we arrange the retainer, whether that's a legal aid government funded program or we're retained privately. And then we begin working on the basis of claim form. So the basis of claim form is a form that's filed with the government that explains the basis of the client's fear. We file that document, we file the work permit application, and then from that point onward, we're waiting for the hearing to take place. The hearing is usually scheduled, as I said, probably about a year after the basis of claim form is filed. And prior to that hearing, it's a series of meetings to prepare the client for testimony or giving evidence before the tribunal. Again, that's documentary evidence, but that's also the oral testimony of a client. As frequently, we kind of do mock hearings with the client to throw questions at them to see how they'll respond to the questions and give them some advice about how they can explain themselves a bit more thoroughly, as well as pointing out to them some kind of weaknesses in their explanations that they should give a little bit more thought about. Generally speaking, that's in a nutshell the process that we follow from beginning to end in representation.
Sure. And does the government provide interpreters for these hearings?
Absolutely. So once the hearing is scheduled, if the person indicates that they need an interpreter in a certain language, the government funds an interpreter to appear at the hearing.
Nice, nice. Now, here in the United States, an asylum claim, like in Michigan, typically is cost American dollars, I would say between $8,000 and $10,000. There are a number of nonprofits that try to help out, but to be honest, they're oversaturated for the amount because we don't have the type of government funding available. These are nonprofit organizations that are underfunded, and there just really is not enough money for people to have a lawyer represented without paying for a private attorney. Private attorneys here in Michigan, I would say typically between $8,000 to $10,000 for an asylum claim, whether it's an affirmative asylum claim with the interview. For example, if you apply for it in Michigan, your interview would be in Chicago, or a defensive claim would be in court. Now, what is the typical cost for like a private attorney for a refugee claim in Canada? What does it vary between?
I would say it ranges anywhere from probably about $6,000 to $10,000, but you are dealing with Canadian dollars, so that's really significantly less in terms of the U.S. market.
Now, and the final question that I have is, at these hearings here in the United States, if you apply affirmatively, there's no government lawyer trying to deport the client. However, if you file defensively, which is the majority of the claims, you have a government lawyer trying to deport your client or trying to prove that your client is a liar. Is there a government lawyer in those hearings that is working to, in essence, deport the refugee person who's trying to make the claim?
There is not. Back in the early days when I first started to practice, there typically was a government lawyer that would appear at the hearings, but they were occupying a neutral role and they weren't aggressively trying to get the person's claim denied. But these days, however, there is nobody from quote unquote the other side that shows up trying to prosecute or get the claim denied. The only exception to that is for people who are suspected of being security threats, people who have a lengthy criminal record, or are suspected of having fraudulent documents. But that happens probably maybe in 10% of the cases.
Okay, absolutely interesting. Now, if people wanted to get a hold of you or your law firm, would like phone number be the best way to contact you, or how do you recommend that people get in touch with you if they want to explore their options
Well,
to apply for a refugee claim?
Yeah, a lot of our contact details are boldly displayed on our website, migrationlawgroup.com, MIGRATION lawgroup.com, or they could email reception@migrationlawgroup.com, or just call us. The phone number is prominently displayed on the website.
Awesome. And if you're interested about U.S. asylum law or how that works, give me a call here at my office. My phone number is 734-369-2378. And my website is immigrationlawpllc.com. Michael, this was a blast. I had a lot of fun, learned a tremendous amount of information. I'm really excited to work with you in the future, comparing the differences between U.S. immigration and Canadian immigration law.
Yeah, Brad, thank you for inviting me. This has been a lot of fun, and I look forward to follow-ups. Anything you're interested in about Canadian immigration or refugee law, we'll do it again.
All right. Thanks, Michael.